One of the really interesting things that's happened, since I started my channel, Manga is becoming bigger and bigger and a bigger player. In fact, I'm going to have a really big, like 5-year deep dive on manga sales versus comic book sales, at least in bookstores, here in a few days. But it appears that they've captured like an entire new generation, actually probably more like 2 or 3 generations of young American comic book readers have gone the way of manga rather than being funneled into like Superman, Batman, Spider-Man characters like that. And while I am a diehard American comic book fan, Valiant is probably my favorite publisher, especially when it's done right, but I have an enormous place in my heart for DC. I still like Marvel quite a bit, even though it's really down right now. I do cheat on comic books with manga on a weekly basis. I'm going to admit that here. I'm not the most fervent reader of manga. I know Jim probably reads a lot more manga than I do, but I do like to dip in on the manga characters. And after, reading manga for about 3 or 4 years now, not nearly as much as I do American comic books, there are a few reasons I think this is happening. Why manga has been able to grab a hold of a couple of generations of young American comic book readers, and basically they have bypassed DC and Marvel Comics. I think there's 3 real reasons this has happened. I want to talk about them today. I don't think these are ultimately like the worst things in the world or enormous negatives on the part of American comic books, but I do think they do play a part on why they're so much more successful, besides just, being cheaper and smaller and more portable and stuff like that, and certainly much more accessible digitally. I think all that plays into it as well. But I do think some of the way that they actually do it really does attract some of these younger readers. First up is their character development. Manga heroes are built on aspiration. They often start weak, overlooked, or powerless, and evolve through relentless effort and personal growth. Naruto begins life as a shunned orphan, and over the course of 700 chapters, transforms into a powerful ninja through training and sacrifice. Deku, born without superpowers in My Hero Academia, earns his strength by studying heroes and pushing himself beyond his limits. In contrast, American comic book heroes typically arrive fully formed. Superman is born with godlike powers, and Spider-Man, though bitten accidentally, rarely expands his abilities. Their stories tend to revolve around moral choices, not personal growth. While exceptions exist, like young X-Men learning control over their powers, they're far less common in American comic books. Manga's emphasis on effort and escalation creates long-term investment and resonates with readers who want to see characters struggle, improve, and triumph, especially younger fans who relate to striving toward potential. And I do think kind of being stuck in this almost like a 40-year bubble where we haven't had very many new characters introduced. We've had some stars like Deadpool, Cable, stuff like that, but there haven't been a lot of them. A lot of that stuff was introduced in the Golden Age, and certainly once Marvel comes around at the beginning of the Silver Age, a lot of these characters are introduced. They have enormous sets of powers in Marvel and DC Comics almost overnight. And in a lot of ways, they are kind of stuck in stasis. They don't really grow. You hope to see personal growth, but even in a character like Spider-Man, he doesn't tend to personally grow. And if he does, he's almost always regressed to the beginning state. So a lot of the investment that you get in the character, it does feel frustrating when a new writer just starts wiping out progression on the character or invest in a personal relationship, and then when a new writer comes on, they kind of remove that stuff. You don't really get that in manga. In fact, they don't really do the sliding timeline. They might have a sliding timeline, but generally speaking, the characters age within manga. Over the years, they get wiser, they get stronger through hard work, perseverance, triumph, experience, and all that kind of stuff. And the character kind of just builds and builds and builds and becomes more powerful. Superman doesn't really become more powerful unless he comes into contact with a new type of kryptonite, and then it's, quickly removed. Spider-Man, maybe for a while he ends up with 8 arms or something like that, but then it's removed and he goes back to his original state with the exact same power set. So a lot of times you are just kind of reading the further adventures of these characters with the exact same power sets. And when they do make deviations in the power sets, it's almost always very temporary. All of a sudden, Superman's not powered. Within a year, he's Superman again. Batman gets his back broke, so he can't be Batman anymore. He gets replaced, but 3 years later, he's back in the saddle again. As good as new, almost no mentions of the time that he was paralyzed for such a long time. Whereas if you go to a character like Deku, who's really cool, he's kind of grating at first. And you're like, man, I almost wish he wasn't here. But then he becomes substantially a better character over time that you really start falling in love with because he starts overcoming obstacles, gaining powers, becoming a better hero, achieving the goals that he always wanted, and becoming more like confident in himself. And it's all because that's what the writer wanted to do with the character. He wanted to grow him over time into what he would ultimately be. But the manga characters tend to just keep growing and changing and evolving, whereas a lot of superheroes, especially with their power sets and the way that they fight criminals and stuff like that, they're very, very stagnant. Like they get to a point and they just kind of stay there. They might go up and down a little bit and deviate, but for the most part, they are who they are almost from day one. Superman, as soon as he arrives on Earth, is super. Yes, he had to grow up, but he was already Kryptonian. We do see Batman training and getting better, but it's almost always in flashback. So it's really a different way to develop the character, you know, within manga. And I do think that probably does appeal for a much younger audience and some of these younger generations that have been captured by manga and kind of bypassed DC Comics. Another thing that I do think plays a much larger role in this than we're willing to give it credit for, creative control. Manga often benefits from a singular creative vision. A series like One Piece was written and drawn by Oda alone since 1997, maintaining narrative cohesion across more than 100 volumes. This clarity and direction allows for consistent world building and character arcs, as seen in Attack on Titans, where Hajime Asayama executed a planned story from start to finish. American comics, by contrast, are built on decades of collaborative reinvention. A character like Batman has been reshaped by dozens of writers and artists, each adding to their own spin, from Bob Kane's original detective roots to Frank Miller's gritty reimagining. This results in multiple origin stories, shifting tones, and even conflicting timelines. The multiverse concept tries to tie it all together, but can overwhelm new readers. Manga's start-to-finish format makes it more accessible, while the legacy model of American comics offers depth, but often at the cost of entry point clarity. And that is 100% true. What is the origin for Superman that you agree with? You know, there are multiples out there. You can go to Man of Steel, you can go to Birthright, you can go back to some of those original stories in the Golden Age when they're spelling out Kal-El arriving on Earth and being adopted by the Kents. There's a lot of different places you can go to a character like Superman and discover the origin like that you want to be the origin. But what even John Byrne did in Man of Steel, and I love Man of Steel, by the way. I think that is the origin for me, to be completely honest, because I'm a part of this, and I love that. I don't believe that was the intention or what Siegel and Schuster intended for the character when they created him, but we're on like 9 or 10 different iterations of Superman, and he could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different writers. So you're always getting a different interpretation, which can be exciting, but it also makes it very, very tonally unfamiliar from writer to writer, from arc to arc, and things of that nature. Like, if you think about Chip Zdarsky's Batman run, Chip Zdarsky was just on the run. What was his spin on Batman? What was his firm belief on who Batman was? I'm not really sure. I think he just kind of deferred to Grant Morrison and said, you know, I've decided my Batman is the Grant Morrison version of Batman. But the Grant Morrison version of Batman wasn't what James Tynion was doing. It certainly wasn't what Tom King was doing. So you've been reading Batman for the last 10 years. You're literally on your 4th version of Batman. And now we're on Hush 2 and about to get to Mac Fraction. It'll probably be our 5th iteration of a completely different view on what Batman is, which can be frustrating, but it can also be exciting. It can be exciting to get a new interpretation or a different spin or somebody else's point of view on that character and what they mean and what they really represent, but it isn't very consistent. And if you want to go read One Piece, you go to chapter 1. And if you want to finish it, the entire One Piece like story, you just keep going numerically until you're into the hundreds. I think is it 111? I know they're well over 100 at this point. Because it is a linear story with essentially one creative voice. Although I do think One Piece might have had somebody come in and finish up some stuff after Oda died. I haven't made it quite there. I decided to go back to the beginning, and it's taking me a while to get through all the One Piece stuff. But that is a fantastic manga, and that is way more new reader specifically accessible. And if you come in as a manga fan, and that's how you're used to reading your comic books, You start out with One Piece and you read it. You start out with My Hero Academia and you read it. You start out with Vampire Hunter D or whatever and you read it and stuff. And that's how you're used to it. Then you try to go over to Marvel and DC, you're going to be screwed. There is no linear Batman story. It just simply cannot happen, not only because there's been so many different iterations of writers with different takes on the character, there's different iterations of the universe. There's been multiple starts and resets that changed timelines and removed history and replaced characters and stuff like that. And it does become very, very confusing, especially if you entered comic books, looking at the manga method. And not to mention, to read One Piece, you have to invest in One Piece. To read Batman, you might have to invest in the Justice League. You might have to invest in an event book. You might need to invest in a Superman book that also ties into that event that spells out some things that are important to Batman. And it can get woefully complicated, especially considering you're having multiple different artists and writers with all these different types of points of view on the character. And they all want their legacy stamp, especially on a character like a Batman or a Superman or a Spider-Man or the X-Men. They wanted to do something that's very unique, that's their legacy on the character. So they will often go in there simply to change things, just so they can say, that's what I did, that's what I added, or that's what I changed. And while it can be very, very exciting, it can also be very, very frustrating. And I do think the linear story format and functionality of the way manga works, one creator basically from beginning to end, probably does serve better in the long haul, although you don't get an 85-year shelf life out of a character like you do with Batman, because no mangaka is going to last that long, especially with the hours, the amount of work they have to do. So there are definitely pros and cons to it, but as a new reader entry point, I think manga has a lot of stuff to offer there. This is another thing that's maybe it's not so much manga, but the way it's treated. And I'm talking about the adaptations. Anime tends to be a faithful companion to manga, often serving as a direct continuation of promotion of the source material. Series like Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood and Hunter x Hunter closely follow their manga counterparts, allowing fans to switch between anime and print without losing their story's thread. This synergy boosts manga sales and keeps audiences engaged. In contrast, American animated shows frequently chart their own course. Teen Titans and Batman the Animated Series, while inspired by comics, often introduce original plots and tones that don't align at all with the print canon. This disconnect makes it difficult for fans of shows to find matching comic storylines, creating a barrier instead of a bridge. Anime acts as an on-ramp to manga, while many American cartoons build separate fan bases that may never cross into comics. That difference helps explain why manga adaptations more effectively convert viewers into readers. And I do think that is probably the number one asset that manga has going for it, besides the price, which I do think is important, is that if you get into an anime and you're like, wow, I really like this Spy Family or whatever that show is. It's actually a really good show. My wife loves that one. But if you go and watch that and you like the first season, you're like, man, I wish the story continues. Oh, it does. Just go get the Spy Family fucking manga. You can just go on and pick up exactly where that story left off and continue reading and know exactly what happened. And that is what happens when these animes bust out on Netflix or Disney Plus or wherever it is that you find them. And then you go and you find the manga that it was sourced from. They're almost always completely faithful. Very few alterations made whatsoever. And it does absolutely spike the sales. And you're going to see it when I go into that 5-year deep dive, that these have an enormous, and I do mean an enormous impact on the long-term viability and sales of manga, especially outside of Japan. When it finally arrives in America and you get the anime and it's been dubbed to English and people get in, they're like, wow, I really like this Chainsaw Man thing, or just Jujutsu Kaisen stuff is pretty cool. The story is still there and you can go right into it. If you get in to like that Justice League Unlimited or whatever, and you're like, wow, Jon Stewart is the fucking man. That is the best Green Lantern of all time. That character legitimately does not exist within DC Comics. Yes, there's a character called Jon Stewart. Yes, he is a Green Lantern, but he ain't that character. And none of those stories really exist within the DC continuity. If you were a big fan of Batman the Animated Series and you're watching and you're like, oh my goodness, this Harley Quinn character is really amazing. That character simply did not exist Unlike John Kent, she literally didn't exist within Batman comic books. That wasn't a comic book character. It was just an animated series character. So if you get into that and you're like, oh, I need to go find more stories about Harley Quinn, they literally didn't exist because that synergy wasn't there. The cartoon production literally does not support the comic book production, which doesn't make sense to me. They're all owned by the same company. You would think that Warner Brothers would want an awesome season of Young Justice to boost sales, like we see with things like Jujutsu Kaisen, for like the trades of Young Justice within DC Comics, but there's like literally like no connective thread. Even when they do like an adaptation of like a major story, like Teen Titans, like Judas Contract, I don't think that it's not like the same team. It's so weird when you go back and see it. And even if you're a fan like Teen Titans Go, my 6-year-old loves Teen Titans Go. If he goes from Teen Titans Go and he turns 12 or 13 and he realizes there's like a groundbreaking Marv Wolfman, George Perez Teen Titans run out there that he should go read, he'll know the name of the characters, but he ain't going to know who those characters are because they literally don't even resemble each other. And of course, Nightwing is going to really confuse him because it's fucking Robin in the Teen Titans Go. So they have all this stuff and then becomes popular, but it comes independently popular from the comic books and they literally don't serve each other. If you're a big fan of like Batman the Animated Series back in the day and you're at the end of season 2, you can't go to the comic book and just continue on and wait for season 3 to come out the next year. It's the end of the road unless they make a season 3. And I do think that is an enormous strength and value add that manga gets right, where the anime studios and the manga publishers work so hand in hand in concert and are faithfully adapting a lot of these things. Now, we do see some sort of faithful adaptations sometimes with some of the movies, but even then they take liberties. And I think it would just be so much more beneficial. Like if you did an X-Men cartoon and X-Men 92 is great. I remember playing the video game and stuff like that. Can you imagine how much better it would have been if they actually would have just like started with giant size fucking X-Men and went through Uncanny? You would have got even more sales on X-Men. People would have been going back and discovering Chris Claremont for the first time and realizing what a great series that was. And it would be a perennial bestseller to this day because they would have been working hand in hand. And now you've got to make comic books for people that like the cartoon because you actually don't have a comic book that supports that because that team doesn't really exist in comic books. You know what I'm saying? It's nuts the way they handle adaptations, and they certainly have it down pat in Japan. Like they get it 100%. Now, there are things about American comic books, because I'm more of an American comic book fan, that I think are far superior. I like the size better. I like the bigger pages. I like the fact that in one page, essentially, what is a panel in an American comic book page is like a full page in a tankobon. That's why they read a little bit different. They read a little bit slower. In one page of American comic book, you might actually get 9 full pages of material that you would get in a tankobon. That is like a large scale example. It's probably more like 2 or 3, but you do get a lot more story told per page in American comic books. I like that the comic books are colored. I think it just looks a lot better. It adds so much life and vitality to it. Not that manga doesn't have great art, because it absolutely does, but I even prefer that colored if I can get it that way. And that's why I kind of like manhwa a little bit right now too, although they don't have as many great stories, in my opinion, as manga. And I certainly like reading my comic books from left to right. Culturally being American, reading that way, it does take a while, even if you're doing it digitally, to kind of go the opposite way. So while there's certainly things that I think that American comic books have in spades for the American audience over manga, they have captured this new audience. I do think the price point of getting 160 pages for $10 versus, if you get 160 pages of an American comic book, it's probably going to be like $30. It's much, much cheaper. Obviously, it's not colored. It's black and white, but I do think that does help. It makes it more of an impulse buy. It feels very much more disposable than an American trade paperback because it's so expensive. One comic book these days of 22, 25 pages is $5, half the price of 160 pages of a manga, which I think is ridiculous. But I think the character development and the way that they continue to grow through the life of the character, because they don't go on for infinity. really does help that out. And I definitely believe having that single creator vision really pays off when you invest in the character, because you aren't going to get multiple different iterations of the character. That is the vision of the creator. That is what he sees the character doing in all these different situations. So there's a level of consistency you just can't get with American comic books. But you also can't do that exciting thing with American comic books where you get the Alan Moore fucking Swamp Thing take. Like, he's not a man that's a Swamp Thing. He's an experiment gone wrong. He's actually a Swamp Thing that thinks he's a man, which is one of the greatest comic books I've ever read in my life. You would never be able to have that in manga because, Len Wein still would have been writing the fucking comic book. He wouldn't have been allowed to do that. So there are pros and cons, but I do think for new reader access, starting at issue 1 or volume 1 is the way to go. And certainly the adaptations, I think, is the best thing that they have going for them. And you can see it in the sales. Anytime one of these animes hits, the fucking sales on the manga just blow up. 10, sometimes 20 times more than like the best-selling DC books, in the book channel, which we're going to get to because I got a big exploration of like 5 years of sales data that I got into that was really interesting. I walked down that rabbit hole, so some of my thoughts on how manga captured that new generation of American readers. Unfortunately, hopefully they will eventually find their way to Batman and Superman, but I do think we can probably learn a few lessons from them as well. If you appreciate what we're doing here on Think Critical YouTube and you'd like to support the mission, talking about comic books, even highlighting some of the major differences between comics and manga and where I think manga probably has an upper hand, the best place to do that is Think Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. There's a button right here. And I do hope to see you there very, very soon.